I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Standing on my own front porch, gripping the official-looking letter in my hands, I read the words over and over again, hoping they would somehow change. But they didn't. According to the Homeowners Association, my house, the very home I had worked so hard for, was no longer mine. The HOA had decided to take it, claiming I had violated their rules, and now they were demanding that I hand over the deed or face legal action. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe a clerical error or a misunderstanding. I had always paid my dues on time, kept my lawn neat, and followed every rule they threw my way. So why was I suddenly being targeted? I took a deep breath and marched down to the HOA office, determined to clear things up. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The chairperson, Mr. Langley, was already waiting for me, a smug smile on his face, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. "You should have seen this coming," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've been out of compliance for months. Unpaid fees, unauthorized modifications. The list goes on." My stomach tightened. That wasn't true. I had records, receipts, and emails to prove it. But when I tried to argue, he simply waved his hand dismissively. "It's all in the paperwork," he said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "If you have a problem, take it up with the courts." But I wouldn't bother. The board has already voted. This property will be seized, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a clerical error. This was something bigger. Something personal. And if I didn't fight back, I was going to lose everything. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I pored over every document, every rulebook, every meeting transcript I could get my hands on. What I found made my blood run cold. Hidden in the fine print of the HOA bylaws were vague clauses that gave the board unchecked power to fine homeowners, place lands on properties, and ultimately, seize homes under the right conditions. And guess who had been behind those changes? Mr. Langley himself. The more I dug, the worse it got. I wasn't the first homeowner this had happened to. There were others. People who had lost their homes, their savings, everything, because they didn't have the time, the resources, or the strength to fight back. Some had tried, but their cases mysteriously fell apart. Key documents went missing, complaints were ignored, and somehow the HOA always won. I was angry, but more than that, I was afraid. What if I ended up like them? What if I really did lose my home? What if fighting back only made things worse? But then I remembered something my grandfather used to say. The only way to lose is to give up before the fight even starts. So I did the only thing I could do. I hired a lawyer. From the very first meeting, my attorney could tell something was off. "This isn't just an HOA dispute," she said, flipping through the documents. "This is fraud. And if we can prove it, they won't just lose the case. They could go to prison." That was the first time I felt a real spark of hope. But hope wasn't enough. We needed evidence. And the only way to get it was to go straight to the source. We started attending HOA meetings, asking questions, and pushing for records. At first, the board stonewalled us, refusing to hand over anything. But we kept pushing, and slowly the cracks began to show. One night, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. The subject line was just 2 words: "Check this." Attached was a file filled with internal emails, financial statements, and board meeting notes, documents that had never been made public. As I scrolled through, my heart pounded. There it was. Proof that Mr. Langley had been manipulating fines, forging signatures, and funneling money from HOA funds into private accounts. This wasn't just an overreach of power. It was a full-blown scam. Armed with this new evidence, we took the case to court. And that's when things really got interesting. Because Mr. Langley had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me. I sat outside the courthouse that morning, gripping a folder full of documents, my heart pounding against my ribs. This was it, the moment where everything I had been fighting for would finally be laid out in front of a judge. But even though I had the evidence, I knew better than to assume this would be easy. Mr. Langley had been running this HOA for years. He had connections, influence, and a track record of making people disappear, at least from their homes. If he had been bold enough to forge signatures and manipulate fines, who knew what else he was capable of? The courtroom doors creaked open, and I stepped inside, trying to ignore the way Langley smirked at me from across the room. He looked relaxed, confident, as if he had already won. And maybe, in his mind, he had. After all, how many people before me had tried to take him down, only to fail? As the judge entered and the case was called, my attorney wasted no time laying out the facts. She spoke clearly, methodically, showing the court the fraudulent fines, the altered documents, and the internal emails that had mysteriously found their way into my inbox. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same thing. Mr. Langley had orchestrated this entire scheme to seize properties and profit off unsuspecting homeowners. For the first time, I saw the smug expression on Langley's face start to slip. He leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, who nodded stiffly before standing up to argue. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a disgruntled homeowner trying to avoid paying his dues, she said, her voice dripping with practiced confidence. The HOA has acted within its rights every step of the way. If there were clerical errors, they were unintentional. But this, she gestured toward my folder, this is nothing but speculation and hearsay. I clenched my fists under the table. Hearsay? I had the receipts, the signatures, the emails. How could she brush it all off so easily? But the judge didn't look convinced by her words. He flipped through the documents, his brow furrowed. These signatures appear to be inconsistent, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And this fine, it was issued after the board had already voted to seize the property. Langley's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. A clerical mistake, Your Honor. The judge didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to me. Tell me, when did you first suspect something was wrong? I took a deep breath. When I got that letter saying my house was being seized, I knew it had to be a mistake. I had always followed the rules. But when I went to the HOA office, I realized it wasn't a mistake, it was a setup. And what led you to believe this was intentional fraud and not an error? I hesitated for only a second before answering, because I found other homeowners who had gone through the same thing. They all had the same pattern, unexplained fines, sudden violations, and then, one day, the HOA moved in and took everything. A quiet murmur ran through the courtroom. I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. Langley had been doing this for years, preying on people who didn't have the resources to fight back. Langley must have sensed the shift in the room because for the first time, he spoke up. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice sharper than before. The HOA has done nothing wrong. We act in the best interest of the community. And frankly, this homeowner is just bitter about facing the consequences of his own actions. I almost laughed at how bold he was, standing there pretending to be the victim. But before I could say anything, my lawyer stood up again. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence. She pulled out a thick file and handed it to the judge. These are financial records from the HOA's accounts over the past 5 years. You'll see that a significant portion of the seized properties were later sold to private investors, many of whom have direct business ties to Mr. Langley himself. Silence. Even Langley's lawyer looked startled. The judge skimmed through the pages, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Langley. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Langley's jaw tightened. "Those transactions are perfectly legal." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps, but legal doesn't always mean ethical. And given the other irregularities in this case, I'm not convinced everything was above board." For the first time, I felt the tide turning in my favor. But I also knew better than to celebrate too soon. Langley wasn't the kind of man to go down without a fight, and I had a feeling he still had a few tricks up his sleeve. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The case wasn't over yet. The judge had ordered a deeper investigation into the HOA's finances, which meant more waiting, more stress, and more time for Langley to cover his tracks. I knew I couldn't let my guard down, because if Langley had gotten away with this for so long, he wasn't going to let me be the one to take him down. And I had a sinking feeling the worst was yet to come. The days after the hearing felt like a strange limbo. I had exposed Langley's fraudulent schemes in court, but the battle wasn't over. The judge had ordered an investigation, but investigations took time. And time was something I wasn't sure I had. Because while I waited, Langley was still out there, still in control of the HOA, still pulling strings behind the scenes. I started noticing little things. My mailbox, which had always been stuffed with HOA notices and bills, suddenly stopped getting mail altogether. When I called the post office, they told me my address had been temporarily suspended due to a change request, one I never made. My trash cans, which I left neatly at the curb for collection, mysteriously disappeared. Small inconveniences, things that could be brushed off as coincidences, but I knew better. This was Langley's way of reminding me that he wasn't finished. Then there were the neighbors. Some of them, the ones who had quietly cheered me on from the sidelines, suddenly avoided me. Others, the ones loyal to Langley, started watching me differently. Long, suspicious glances, hushed whispers when I passed. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I saw two board members standing at the edge of my property, just staring. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, arms crossed, before walking off. I tried to push past the paranoia, but it was getting harder. It wasn't just my home at stake anymore. The more I dug into Langley's history, the more I realized just how deep this went. There were others, former homeowners who had lost everything, some of whom had simply packed up and disappeared. And when I tried to reach out to them, most refused to talk. A few wouldn't even answer the door. But then, late one night, I got a call. The number was blocked, and for a second, I debated ignoring it. But something told me to answer. A shaky voice came through the line. "You need to be careful." I sat up straight. "Who is this?" A pause. "Then you don't know me, but I know Langley. I was on the board years ago. I tried to stop him. And then things started happening." I swallowed hard. What kind of things? The voice hesitated. "First, my car got vandalized. Then I started getting fines for things I never did. One day, I came home, and there was an eviction notice on my door. I fought it, but the paperwork had already been processed. I lost everything. And when I tried to go public with what I knew, they trailed off, but I could hear the fear in their breath." "What happened?" I asked. A long silence. Then in a whisper, I got run off the road one night. I was lucky, but I got the message. I left town, and you should too. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, gripping my phone, my hands ice cold. I had always known Langley was dangerous, but this was something else. If this person was telling the truth, then I wasn't just fighting a corrupt HOA. I was dealing with someone willing to destroy lives to protect his empire. I had to be smart, careful, but most of all, I had to be ready for whatever Langley did next. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. I told her about the call, about the strange things happening around my house. She didn't look surprised. "He's testing you," she said, "trying to make you crack before this case moves forward." Then what do we do? She tapped her pen against her desk, thinking, "We double down. We push harder. If he's this desperate to shut you up, it means he knows we're close to something big." We filed motions to speed up the investigation. We requested additional financial audits on the HOA's accounts. We even reached out to local news outlets, trying to shine a bigger spotlight on the case. That's when things escalated. One evening, I came home to find a letter taped to my door. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, the paper crumpled as if it had been clenched in someone's fist before being delivered. Asterisk asterisk, drop the case. Or else asterisk asterisk. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct threat. I took a picture of the note and sent it to my lawyer. Then I called the police. But when an officer showed up, he barely glanced at the paper before shrugging. "Without any proof of who left this, there's not much we can do," he said. "Could be a prank." A prank. I wanted to argue, but I could already see it in his face. He wasn't going to take this seriously. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Langley had friends in more places than just the HOA board. I couldn't trust the system to protect me, which meant I had to protect myself. I installed cameras around my house. I changed my locks. I even started parking my car in different places, just in case someone was watching my patterns. But even with all those precautions, I felt the tension tightening around me, like a noose slowly drawing in. Then a few days later, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was working late, going through more records my lawyer had uncovered, when my phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. Asterisk asterisk, check your front door asterisk asterisk. My heart pounded. I hesitated, then slowly made my way to the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty street. But when I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting on my welcome mat was a single sheet of paper. A copy of my home's deed. Except this one had someone else's name on it. Langley's. I looked around, but the street was silent, empty. Whoever had left it was already gone. I clenched the paper in my fists, my pulse hammering. Langley was making it clear. He still thought this house belonged to him. And if I didn't back down, he was going to make sure it did. I stood there, gripping the forged deed, my mind racing. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a declaration of war. Langley wasn't just threatening me. He was telling me exactly how far he was willing to go. He had already stolen homes before. He had destroyed lives. And now he was coming for mine. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. If he was this bold, that meant he was desperate. The investigation was closing in, and he was running out of ways to scare me off. But I couldn't ignore the danger. If he had the connections to forge legal documents, he had the power to make them real. I called my lawyer immediately, my voice tight with urgency. She told me to stay put, to document everything, and to wait for her call in the morning. But I couldn't just sit there, not after everything that had happened. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof that Langley had been orchestrating this fraud for years. So I made a decision. I was going to break into the HOA office. It wasn't as reckless as it sounded. Technically, the office was open to all homeowners during business hours. I had every right to be there. but I needed to be there alone, without Langley or his board members watching me. I knew they kept files, physical records that weren't digitized, papers that could show exactly how deep this corruption went. If I could find them, I could bring Langley down once and for all. I waited until midnight when the neighborhood was quiet. The HOA office wasn't far, just a short walk past the clubhouse. My heart pounded as I approached the building, its windows dark, the security lights flickering weakly overhead. The front door was locked, as expected, but I had come prepared. Using a trick I had seen online, I slid a laminated card between the latch and the frame, wiggling it until I heard the faint click asterisk of the lock releasing. My breath hitched. This was it. The inside smelled like old paper and stale coffee. I moved quickly, keeping my phone's flashlight low. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with different categories: financial reports, homeowner complaints, property sales. I scanned them until I found what I was looking for: *** foreclosures and acquisitions ***. My hands shook as I pulled open the drawer. Inside were dozens of folders, each with a homeowner's name on it. I flipped through them, recognizing some of the names: people who had mysteriously left the neighborhood, people who had violated HOA rules one too many times. And then I saw my name. I yanked the folder out and opened it. Inside was a stack of documents detailing fines I had never received, violations that never happened. There were letters, fake letters, supposedly from me, acknowledging debts I never owed. At the bottom was a pre-filled eviction notice, dated for next week. Langley had already set the wheels in motion. My stomach clenched, but I kept going. I needed more. Digging deeper, I found something even worse: bank statements tied to a private account in Langley's name. Thousands of dollars funneled from HOA fees, quietly transferred under vague expenses. And then, buried beneath those statements, a list of preferred buyers. Investors Langley had been working with to acquire foreclosed homes at dirt cheap prices. My house was already on that list. I had everything I needed. Just as I was about to take photos, I heard a noise. The front door creaked open. I froze, heart hammering. Someone was inside. Footsteps echoed in the darkness, slow and deliberate. I killed my flashlight and ducked behind the desk, clutching my phone. The footsteps got closer, pausing near the filing cabinets. I could hear papers rustling, drawers opening. They were looking for something. Or someone. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around my phone. Should I run? Should I try to sneak out? Then through the dim emergency light, I saw him. Langley. He stood just a few feet away, sifting through the files, his movements sharp and angry. Had he figured out I was onto him? Had someone tipped him off? I needed to get out. Slowly, I inched back toward the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. But just as I reached the door, my foot brushed against a loose floorboard. ***. Langley's head snapped up. "Who's there?" Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted. Behind me, I heard Langley curse, his footsteps pounding after me. I hit the door at full speed, shoving it open and sprinting outside. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I could hear Langley shouting, but I didn't turn around. I ran straight for my house, my mind racing. I had the proof. I just had to make it to safety. I reached my door, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking too hard to fit them into the lock. Then I heard it. A car engine. Headlights flashed to life, flooding my driveway with blinding light. The roar of an accelerating engine filled the air. I barely had time to react before the car lurched forward, tires screeching. And it was coming straight for me. I barely had time to throw myself to the side before the car barreled toward me, its tires screeching against the pavement. My body hit the ground hard, pain jolting through my side as the vehicle slammed into my trash bins, sending them flying. My ears rang from the impact, but I forced myself to move, crawling toward my porch as the car skidded to a stop. The driver's door swung open, and I knew I had seconds before whoever was inside came after me. I scrambled up, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. My front door felt impossibly far away, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Behind me, I could hear hurried footsteps approaching. A low voice cursed under their breath. I twisted the key into the lock, shoved the door open, and slammed it shut just as a heavy fist pounded against the wood. "Open the door." Langley's voice was sharp, furious. I staggered back, my heart pounding against my ribs. He had completely lost it. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was an outright attack. He wasn't even trying to hide it. The pounding on my door continued, harder this time. I backed away, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. I needed to call the police, but I knew Langley was powerful. If he had the right people in his pocket, would they even take me seriously? Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence stretched across the house, so thick I could hear my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare move, my body frozen in place. Then through the peephole, I saw it, Langley standing there, his expression eerily calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a phone, and made a call. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I didn't need to. The look on his face told me everything. He wasn't backing down. A few seconds later, he turned and walked back to his car. The tires screeched as he sped off, leaving behind the scent of burned rubber. I sank to the floor, my body shaking. What had I just survived? But before I could process it, my phone buzzed in my hand. A text message. Asterisk asterisk, unknown number, asterisk asterisk. You don't know who you're messing with. Drop it before it's too late. A chill ran down my spine. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. This wasn't just Langley anymore. Someone else was involved, someone watching me closely enough to send that message the moment he drove away. I needed help. I wasn't sure who I could trust, but there was one person who had always warned me about Langley, Mrs. Porter. She was one of the few original homeowners left, and she had been fighting against him for years. If anyone knew how deep this corruption went, it was her. Ignoring the pain in my side, I grabbed my keys and rushed out the back door, careful to stay out of sight. The last thing I needed was another unwanted visitor. Mrs. Porter lived just a few blocks away, her small house tucked behind towering oak trees. I knocked twice, my pulse still racing. After a few moments, the porch light flickered on, and the door creaked open. She took one look at me and pulled me inside. "What happened?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning my face. I didn't even know where to start. The forged documents, the threats, the attack, the message. By the time I finished, she had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "I knew Langley was dangerous," she said, her voice quiet, but I didn't know it had gotten this bad. I leaned forward. "There's more. Someone else is helping him. Someone powerful." I showed her the message. "Do you know who it could be?" She hesitated for just a moment, just long enough for me to notice. "You know something," I pressed. Mrs. Porter let out a slow breath. "I don't know names, but I know Langley isn't acting alone. He's been making deals with developers, selling off foreclosed properties under the table. The HOA board is just a cover. He's part of something bigger." My stomach twisted. Something bigger. She nodded. There have been disappearances. My breath caught. Disappearances. She leaned in, lowering her voice. Homeowners who pushed back too hard. They didn't just lose their houses. They vanished. No warnings, no traces left behind. Just gone. A shiver ran down my spine. This was worse than I thought. Langley wasn't just running a fraudulent HOA scheme. He was part of something much darker. I clenched my fists. I couldn't just let this go. But I also knew one thing for sure. If I wasn't careful, I could be next. The weight of Mrs. Porter's words settled deep in my chest, but there was no time to dwell on fear. If Langley and his people were making homeowners disappear, then I had no choice. I had to bring everything into the light before it was too late. I had already gathered enough proof to expose his fraudulent scheme, but now I needed something bigger. I needed to connect him to the developers, to the missing homeowners, to whatever deeper corruption was lurking beneath the surface. I spent the next few days meticulously documenting everything. The forged documents, the unauthorized sales, the false fines imposed on homeowners, every last detail. I even managed to retrieve deleted emails from the HOA servers, revealing conversations between Langley and several unknown contacts discussing illegal property transfers. The pieces were coming together, but something still didn't add up. Langley wasn't smart enough to orchestrate something this big alone. Someone else was pulling the strings. Then out of nowhere, I got an email from an anonymous sender. ***, meet me at the old clubhouse. I have information on Langley. Come alone. ***. It could have been a trap, but I didn't have a choice. If there was any chance of getting closer to the truth, I had to take it. I tucked my phone into my pocket, grabbed my hidden voice recorder, and drove to the clubhouse, my heart hammering the whole way. The place had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The only light came from a flickering bulb in the hallway. I moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards echoing around me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling. Before I could react, a shadow moved from the corner, and someone stepped into the dim light. My breath caught. It was Langley. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in a dark suit, his presence radiating quiet authority. His face was unfamiliar, but something about him sent a chill through me. Langley smirked. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? I clenched my fists. Who is he? I demanded, nodding toward the man. The stranger chuckled. I'm the one who actually runs things around here, he said smoothly. Langley is just a useful tool. Everything clicked into place. Langley was nothing more than a puppet. This man, whoever he was the real power behind everything. He took a step closer. You've caused a lot of trouble. I could make you disappear like the others. My stomach tightened, but I refused to show fear. I have everything I need to take you down, I said. Emails, forged documents, even recorded calls. Langley stiffened, but the man just laughed. And who do you think is going to listen? He said, the police, the courts, I own them all. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. What if he was right? What if everything I had gathered wasn't enough? Then suddenly, a voice echoed from the doorway. That's funny, because I don't think the judge will see it that way. We all turned at once. Standing there was Mrs. Porter, along with 2 uniformed officers. And right behind them was Judge Whitmore, one of the few people in town Langley hadn't managed to corrupt. The color drained from Langley's face. What is this? He stammered. Mrs. Porter held up a small device. It's amazing what you can capture with a little recorder. Panic flashed across the mysterious man's face, but it was too late. The officers moved in, slapping cuffs on both of them. Langley shouted, struggling against their grip, but the other man stayed silent, his expression cold. Judge Whitmore turned to me. "We've been looking into this for a long time, but we needed proof. Thanks to you, we finally have it." Relief flooded through me as I let out a shaky breath. It was over. Or so I thought. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't over. Not really. He wasn't worried. Because people like him always had a backup plan. I had won this battle, but the war, that was still out there, waiting. As they dragged Langley and the other man away, the stranger turned his head slightly and locked eyes with me. Then, just before stepping out the door, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. In the days that followed, everything felt surreal. Langley was gone, taken into custody along with his mysterious handler. News spread fast, and for the first time in years, the homeowners in our neighborhood felt a sense of relief. The HOA board was immediately dissolved, and an investigation was launched into the corruption that had plagued us for so long. But despite the victory, something lingered in the back of my mind, the way that man had smiled at me before being taken away. It wasn't the look of someone who had lost. It was a warning. I tried to push it aside, focusing instead on rebuilding. With Langley out of the picture, many of the unfair fines and foreclosures were overturned. Homeowners who had been forced out were given a chance to reclaim their properties, and new leadership was brought in to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. The weight that had hung over our community for so long was finally lifting. Mrs. Porter, despite everything she had been through, was as strong as ever. "I told you that man was bad news," she said one afternoon as we sat on her porch, watching the sunset. "But you did good, kid. You didn't back down." I smiled, but my mind was still turning. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked. She sighed, folding her hands together. "It never really is, not with people like that." She looked at me carefully. "But you made a difference, and sometimes that's enough." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep down, I knew this fight had only scratched the surface. The real power, the real corruption, ran deeper than we had imagined. A few weeks later, I received an official letter from Judge Whitmore. The case against Langley was moving forward, and the evidence we had gathered was enough to ensure he wouldn't be able to manipulate his way out of it. But the other man, the one who had been pulling the strings, had been released on bail. That fact didn't surprise me, but it did send a chill through me. Still, I refused to live in fear. Our community was stronger now, more aware. The homeowners weren't just going to sit back and let history repeat itself. We had fought too hard, come too far. If anyone tried to take advantage of us again, they would find a neighborhood that wasn't so easy to control. One evening, as I walked past my house, I noticed something on my doorstep. A small, unmarked envelope. My stomach tightened as I reached down, carefully opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper with just a few typed words. Asterisk asterisk, you won this round, but you're not done. Asterisk asterisk. A slow breath escaped my lips as I stared at the note. A part of me had been expecting something like this. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. The fight wasn't over, but this time I wasn't alone. And no matter what came next, I was ready.